Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those on the West Coast. Welcome to our webinar titled The Cost of Jail Calls and Commissary Markups, How Cities and Counties Can Implement Racially Equitable Reforms for Incarcerated People. My name is Devon Bodie, and I am a Senior Research Associate at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. We are based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is really to illuminate and solve the most critical financial challenges facing American households and to make financial security for all a top national priority. For the past 2 years, we've been working on the issue of government fines and fees. Across the country, many state, county, and municipal governments have been increasingly turning to fines and fees to make up for budget shortfalls, especially when faced with the need to raise revenue. The practice of imposing fines, fees, court costs, jail costs, and other debts onto residents disproportionately impacts low-income communities and communities of color, specifically Black communities. Studies actually show that cities with large Black populations are associated with levying larger amounts of fines and fees on their residents. Fines and fees that go unpaid become a debt to the government, which has broad powers to enforce collection through suspending driver's license, garnishing wages, and even excluding debtors from public employment. And the harshest consequence of these debts is jail time, which further involves communities of color in a criminal justice system that already overcharges them, over-incarcerates them, and enacts overt brutality on Black people, which so many of us spoke out against during last summer's Black Lives Matter protests. This brings me to the subject of today's conversations. When incarcerated, people are also subjected to high markups on things like phone calls and commissary items, and these are a significant financial drain on households. This is why we are partnering today with the San Francisco Financial Justice Project. Ann Stuhldreher and her team have done amazing work surveying over 700 incarcerated people on this issue and really just driving policy change in San Francisco County. In today's webinar, we'll not only hear about their work, but we'll hear from 4 panelists who are deeply involved in local criminal justice advocacy. Next slide, please. So today, our 4 speakers are Paul Briley of All of Us or None, Amika Moda of Young Women's Freedom Center, Valentina Cedino of Young Community Developers, and Bianca Tylick of Worth Rises. With that, I'd like to invite Ann to the virtual stage to give us just an overview of her work.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited that we're going to have this conversation here today. Once again, my name is Ann Stuhldreher. I direct the Financial Justice Project in the Office of the San Francisco Treasurer. And I'm excited we're having this conversation because I think a lot of people in the general public don't know that every day across our country, incarcerated people and their families struggle to pay high prices for basic things like phone calls and basic food and hygiene items in jail, stores, or commissary. These high prices are really meant to generate revenue for jail operations and programs and to generate profits for the corporate providers of these services. But the fact is that they lay a heavy financial burden on incarcerated people and their families. These costs can easily add up to several $100s a month. These costs are borne by people oftentimes with very low incomes who can't afford them, who then have to make really hard choices. Do I pay to stay in touch with my incarcerated loved one, or do I pay my rent or these bills? These costs, I think a lot of people also don't realize, are primarily borne by people's families. As Devon mentioned, families of color are overrepresented in our carceral system. And so these costs are borne mainly by families of color and most oftentimes by women of color in these families. These high costs also have a really negative effect on family connectiveness and people's reentry prospects. When we make it harder for people to stay in touch with their families, it really, the research shows, has a negative impact on their reentry chances and just their ability to get through their time in jail and then get back on their feet when they get out. We really want to be doing everything we can to make it easier for people to stay connected to their families, not harder. It was really for these reasons and others that a lot of people came together and worked together in San Francisco. We became the first city in the nation to do several things at the same time: to make all jail phone calls free, to stop inflating and marking up items in the jail store, and commit to put people over profits, to permanently say we are never, ever again going to generate revenue from incarcerated people and their families. A lot of folks came together, as I said, to make this happen. The call for reform was really led by grassroots groups in the San Francisco Jail Justice Coalition, formerly incarcerated people and their family members. And they worked collaboratively with us at the San Francisco Financial Justice Project, with the San Francisco Sheriff's Office, and with San Francisco Mayor London Breed. In the end, every elected official in San Francisco voted to support these reforms and to make them permanent. I'm really excited that we have so many of the key leaders who made these reforms happen in San Francisco here today to have this conversation. I would like to ask them all to turn on their cameras right now and join the conversation. We are just going to talk about what we did in San Francisco, why we did it, how we did it, what we learned along the way, and what our recommendations are for other places that want to consider reforms like these. I know there's a lot of people with a lot of expertise on this webinar. We really want to hear from you too. So we're going to have some time for questions as well. But let's get this conversation started. And I'm going to start first with Amika Moda, who is with the Young Women's Freedom Center and worked really hard to make this happen in San Francisco. So Amika, I was just talking about how San Francisco really came to this decision after examining the financial drain of these costs of high phone calls and commissary items on families and the impact on family connectedness and reentry. Can you talk a little bit about what phone call prices and commissary costs look like in San Francisco prior to these reforms?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for bringing us all together to kind of celebrate this victory in San Francisco and talk about how to continue these efforts elsewhere. So I think that what we had calculated the prices to be for phone calls in San Francisco before the reforms, I think we calculated like to make 2 15-minute phone calls a day. Our average jail stay in San Francisco was about 70 days. The cost of that was about $300. Over a year stay in San Francisco County, it could be over $1,500. And that was San Francisco. There are definitely places where it's 3 times as high to keep in touch with loved ones. And then as far as commissary goes, before we had these reforms, the commissary markup was about 43% on everything we bought. So soap, hygiene products, noodles, shoes, things like that. The markup was 43%.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amika. Amika, can you tell us, when you were incarcerated, you were trying to parent from afar. Can you tell us about your experience, with calling your children from jail?
Yeah.
What that was like?
Yeah, so I was separated from my children for about 7 years due to incarceration. And what I really want to bring here today is the feeling of that. because I think the data speaks for itself. Folks are going to have a lot of that to look at the end here. But, you know, these 15-minute phone calls that we have with our loved ones and our children are lifelines. And so, you know, what happens in these 15-minute calls when we're trying to parent behind bars? We have a lot on our plates. We are, you know, trying to problem solve with our children. We're trying to listen to their problems and give advice. We are trying to support them as best we can and maintain these relationships. You know, if we're blessed enough to have a visit, we get a couple hours, we get to hold them and kiss them. But a lot of us don't have access to visits. A lot of us are relying on those 15-minute phone calls to maintain our relationships. And so I think that often, you know, we don't necessarily think of like these 15 minutes, what do they mean to our children, to us? I just feel like there's sacred business that's happening in these 15-minute calls, you know, and these are literally our lifelines to staying connected to our loved ones. There's never enough time. I remember, you know, I had 3 children during that incarceration, and they would set the timer for 5 minutes a piece so they could all get a turn. And so, yeah, I think that, you know, there's this feeling that we can never do enough behind bars. We can never support our children the way we want to and our loved ones. So we have a lot to do in these 15-minute calls.
Bianca, Amika, thank you so much for sharing that. Valentina Cedeno, I want to ask you to come in now from Young Community Developers, and you also worked very hard to make this happen in San Francisco. You know, I mentioned that the research shows that phone call and commissary costs are most often paid by people's families and support networks, and we found this to be true in San Francisco as well. I just want to ask Valentina, were you surprised by this finding?
No, thanks, Anne, for inviting me to this conversation. But no, not surprised at all. I mean, as Amika mentioned, you know, most incarcerated folks rarely have a way to sustain the cost, you know, of the phone calls, the commissary expenses, you know, including tablet fees now, video visits, you know, the lawyer, you know, fees, you know, et cetera, just, you know, on their own. So they rely heavily on their family, their support networks, you know, to come up with the funds to keep them in communication with the outside world, you know, and then also with the basic needs, having hygiene and just, you know, food. So often, you know, the family members are responsible for the calls and visitation, you know, are their closest loved ones, like the women in their family, typically their mothers, the partners, girlfriends, wives, you know, the sisters, etc. And then, you know, are often just low income, you know, families. And like you had stated earlier, women of color, you know, it's not uncommon for loved ones to go into debt to cover these phone, visitation, package expenses. You know, and especially in San Francisco and the Bay Area, which is, you know, everywhere now too, but there's a huge wealth gap, you know, and people are struggling. So it's unfortunately a common practice where in these situations to use the concept of like the stealing from Peter to pay Paul theory, where you got to cut corners, where you maybe, you know, pay PG&E or other utility bills late, you know, for, or not at all for months at a time. And so, you know, you're at your very limit, you know, phone lines can get shut off. Sometimes you have to pay your rent, your mortgage late. Pretty much almost, you know, some folks go to the point of almost foreclosure because due just to lack of payment. Or even more often, families are just going without or having less than, you know, such as buying less groceries or getting, you know, not enough things for their kids or their families overall, you know, having limited transportation or gas funds, you know, just all the basic needs because, and so on, just all in account to, in exchange to cover these fees for their incarcerated loved ones, because you really want to make sure you have that connection with them.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Valentina. And, you know, in your day-to-day work, you're supporting folks who are reentering and who are getting back on their feet. And you've also supported incarcerated loved ones in your own family. Is there anything else you want to mention just about your experience or what it's like trying to pay for these costs from the outside?
Yes, it's definitely challenging. I think tensions are usually high considering the circumstances. So it's important to support these barriers and try to alleviate stress wherever you can, especially knowing that, increased communication improves reentry, to solidify connections, resources, just other, just upon release, so that they have access to their housing or shelter, employment opportunities, and just overall maintaining the communication with their families, their children. That in itself often, assists in stress level reduction, and typically leads to more successful outcomes, to have the ability to prepare and just to plan with others and your family or your closest, supports. But as a family member, you also figure out a way to be that lifeline to your loved one, even if it's difficult or you have to make sacrifices like going without the necessities on your own, but you do so in order to just remain in contact with your loved one and to be informed. I mean, lots of time there's other friends or families that won't go through the trouble of even setting up a prepaid account or add money to phones to put money on their books or whatever it is, so you typically, if you're the closest connection, you're the one and you're that source. We are dependent on to figure that part out and just make it happen by any means necessary. And that's just an unsaid pressure and financial obligation that we take on, adding, and budgeting those financial fees into our monthly expenses, and no fault of our own, but just to care for our loved ones, to make sure they have something. And you understand when you're in this position, you understand that you're their connection to the outside world, and that you also want to be available to stay updated on their status, on their well-being. Things change so often for folks incarcerated, and as the family who care, you want to be informed of any shifts, transfers, lockdowns, anything where you're not going to be, knowing what's going on, so especially during this pandemic and COVID, where we aren't getting in-person visits, the mail is inconsistent. So we rely solely on phone calls and, if we can, the video visits to stay connected. So, the biggest thing is just part of rehabilitation is about reunification. And so you need consistent communication to do that.
Valentina, thank you so much for sharing that. I want to bring Bianca Tylik into this conversation from Worth Rises. Bianca, you were such a huge help to us in San Francisco, and you've really helped community activists and others, in New York and throughout the country advance reforms like these. And I just want to ask you, does this problem and the challenge, does it look similar all over the country? How would you answer that?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. Thank you for having me. Absolutely. I think it's the challenge that Amika and Valentina have raised is remarkably similar all over the country, no matter sort of where you are. Families are struggling to support their loved ones inside, to have open lines of communication, and where there are minor variations, the variations are familiar. We hear sort of the same stories over and over and over of families that are struggling to pay a bill or pay a car note or put food on the table because of the cost of calls. We talk to mothers who, tell us time and time again what mother wouldn't answer the phone if she could, or would do anything that she possibly could in order to answer that phone call. And so that reality is a reality that is persistent for the 2.2 million people who are incarcerated and their families. And that's because prison phone industry is a $1.4 billion industry dominated by 3 corporations across the country. So this $1.4 billion industry, 40% is owned by one corporation by the name of Securus, 40% is controlled by its largest competitor, GTL or Global Tellink, and 10% is run by ICS or IC Solutions. And so that's 90% of the market right there. And they deploy many of the same practices, whatever they can get away with all over the country.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that, Bianca, and just laying it out so clearly. And, I remember when you helped us and the sheriff's office in San Francisco, and you did a revenue analysis looking at jail phone calls, and you found and concluded and shared with us, how this was really an unsustainable source of revenue. And I just wonder if you could just talk a little more, if there's anything you want to add about the business model behind, phone calls and these issues.
Sure. So I think it's important to understand how this industry sort of emerged. It emerged in the 1980s. It came out of the breakup of the AT&T monopoly that opened the door for many telecom corporations to start providing service to people across the country. And niche corporations really carved out the prison industry as a unique area where they would sort of grab hold. And one of the ways in which they did that was by essentially agreeing to share the profit, the revenues that they earned with the actual agencies. So now they charge as much as $1 a minute for people to be on the phone. I mean, we're talking in 2021 where we pay almost toll rates and nothing else. People who are incarcerated and their families are still paying these toll rates. And so, the most expensive calls can range up to over $16 for a 15-minute phone call. And that's in part because of the greed of the corporations and what they're charging. And then the other part is what states and local agencies are taking and what they like to refer to as commissions, but what in any other area would be called kickbacks. And so what really happens in this model is that you have the agency, whether that be a state department of correction or a local jail, essentially signing a profit sharing agreement with a corporation. And what that does is it means that the agency, the government agency, is really a partner of the corporation against their community, and looking, together as business partners to extract as much wealth as is possible out of those communities, and use it in a variety of ways. But the reality is we know that there is, a feeling in many places that commissions are in fact actually one of the most bipartisan accepted failures of this system. In many states that we go to and we talk to legislators, and we're hoping to, in many cases, make phone calls free like we did in San Francisco with all the incredible advocates there, or at the very least reduce rates, what we hear from conservative and progressive legislators is that commissions feel really wrong. And so what we see is a trend towards eliminating that. And so whenever and that's not just at the state level, but also the federal level. And so when we see these conversations happening around the need to keep control over these commissions, we tell folks those are probably going to go away sooner than later, and so you should start planning now. And so largely, this business model is an antiquated business model that will change, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bianca. I'd love to bring Paul Briley into this conversation. And Paul leads our local All of Us or None chapter in San Francisco. And Paul has also been at the forefront of calling for reform in San Francisco and worked very hard to make these reforms happen. Paul, your organization, All of Us or None, worked really hard to create a survey to survey people incarcerated in the jails and get their thoughts about phone calls and commissary costs. It is one of the publications that we published in advance of this webinar, and I really hope everyone checks it out. Paul, I'm wondering, can you tell us, just about the key findings in the survey and what jumped out at you? And also, as someone who was formerly incarcerated in the San Francisco jails, what are your personal reflections really on these findings and trying to pay these costs?
Hey, and thank you. First, thank you for having me in the space. It's an honor to be here amongst all of the people on the panel. This is really great work that was done in San Francisco, but Among the surveys, the people in it were more friendly and more frank and more expressive than others, partly because of the nature of our survey, and collectively our coalition was especially interested in individual people, whether they were representative or not. Secondly, this wasn't a study of the crossroad culture, but rather we tried to describe a particular group of people and to describe it in such a way that the nature of the content pertaining to the survey might be better understood. While reviewing the surveys, what I overheard was a lack there of conversations between people, comments on behavior, mental health, and the detriment to the empirical matrix of a family. It gave a more intimate insight into the human relationships involved, and I regard that type of material as among the most valuable of my account, not just because of the findings from the survey, but because my personal experience encountering the flawed justice system deepened my understanding and allowed me to identify with the individuals who partook in the survey. To extend the punishment to our loved ones who have done nothing wrong is the systematic employment of intimidation and disintegration. As far as the impact, I mean, it ended the practice of generating revenue for jail operations from high-priced phone calls and jail commissary items, the burden of which, as many said, often falls upon families and loved ones who are disproportionately low income and people of color. From my experience, the situation was completely out of my control. But what hurt me the most was the burden that fell on my family. I knew they would have to pay for everything. And more often than not, many of us in those situations have to rely on our family. And oftentimes, the very thing that put us in that situation was trying to provide for our family. So it can become shameful, embarrassing, and just an assassination of your pride. And just especially now during the pandemic, when all visitation is suspended, having that communication is vital just to stay in contact with our loved ones.
Yeah, and Paul, thanks so much for sharing that. And again, I just encourage folks to check out the survey. I know we all learned a lot. And one thing that stood out to me was I remember in the question of, what do free phone calls mean to you? By far, the most common answer that everyone wrote in was just the word everything. When, as Paul mentioned, when phone calls went to free, immediately overnight, we saw a 40% increase in calls, and people are now spending 80% more time in touch with their support networks and their families. And, that's good for them. That's good for our city. This is just such a investment that is worth making. Bianca, I want to bring you back into the conversation. You helped us and the Sheriff's Office develop a new contract for jail phone calls that had never been tried before and has been called an industry game changer. Can you tell us why it's called that? Oh, Bianca, you're still on mute.
I got it. I want to give a lot of kudos to San Francisco for trying something remarkably new. I think we had every reason to believe it would work, but when things are new, you never really know. So really a lot of, I think all of us had our fingers crossed that this would work out the way that we had hoped and intended. But to dive in a little bit more into that contracting aspect. So a few quick things. A lot of times we hear, well, there's a contract that exists. What can we do about it? I just want to settle everyone's fears immediately and say almost every single contract. In fact, I've never seen one that hasn't had an exit clause that is quite flexible. So I only say almost every because I haven't seen every and I'm waiting for someone to prove me wrong. But in nearly every or in all of the contracts we have seen, there is always a exit clause, which typically allows for a correctional agency to exit a contract, terminate a contract even without cause, with usually anywhere between 60 and 120 days or 180 days notice, which means also that because you can cancel a contract, you can negotiate a contract. That's generally how power works. So with that said, in San Francisco, the contract was actually coming up. So there was a unique opportunity to delve into a new RFP. And what we sort of worked on together and ended up getting out was an RFP that was unlike any other RFP that has been released in this space. It prohibited the corporations from bidding on a per minute basis. I alluded to this earlier, but it is remarkably silly that in 2021, we are still operating in many prisons and jails on a toll rate basis. This just doesn't happen in almost anything else that we see. So what we decided to do was to require corporations that were bidding to bid in two particular compensation structures. One was a per phone line basis. Imagine, your home, how many landlines you might have, or how many cell phones you might have. You pay one bill per line, not the amount of time you use it. And the second option was a fixed rate contract. It was to say, hey, you know how many people we have incarcerated here, you know how many phone lines we have, you know what our typical volume is in a year, because we have that historically, give us a set rate. And so what ended up happening was there was 5 bids, which again, that was the first sort of, nervousness. Would anybody bid? 5 companies bid, and all of them provided different ranges. I think for many, it was the first time, but there was in fact a winning contract that was awarded. And the final cost of that contract will be based on a per line lease basis and will come in at cheaper than families were paying per minute to communicate even to the corporation itself, and not just including what the city was taking. So that is remarkable. It means that the city has no incentive to limit the amount of time people are on the phone, because the phone line simply has service and the city's not paying per minute for people to be on the phone. So not only did this create a better incentive for communication, but it also was cheaper for the city and for the taxpayers all around of San Francisco. And so that's hopefully the direction that we'll see many places moving, especially those that are interested in going to free, is solidifying new contracts where you aren't paying per minute, because that in 2020 is just silly.
Right. That just makes so much sense, Bianca. Thank you so much. Amika, I want to turn back to you. I think some folks have mentioned, during the pandemic, phone calls are the only way people can stay in touch. Visits to jails and prisons are canceled right now. Amika, Young Women's Freedom Center is a network of women and others, throughout California. And I just wonder, what are you hearing from them, during the pandemic about phone calls, and how does this really raise the stakes for reform?
Yeah, I think I know so many people on this panel have already lifted up, in the middle of a pandemic, what it is like to be able to be connected with our loved ones. And so I'm sure many folks can imagine how scary things were for us out here. And that was just magnified on the inside. I mean, prison incarceration, being, incarcerated during a pandemic is terrifying. And there's often misinformation being pumped through the prisons, by correctional officers or, news streams. People are often trying to get access to what is really happening and to hearing kind of from their loved ones. And, I do have to say at the beginning, it was really intense for us because we were getting so many calls from loved ones on the inside that were more worried about us out here than they were for themselves inside. And it was this kind of desperate, attempt to continually be checking on loved ones because it's such a scary time. And so those moments of connection during this pandemic have just been really, really crucial all the way around. And I think that we've seen some really interesting moves by institutions during this pandemic, right? So we saw initially kind of this launch at, one day of free phone calls a month, right? Or a free video visit once a month or twice a month, something like that. So they were, making moves to try to kind of accommodate for the fact that folks have no contact with their loved ones, visiting rooms are shut, there's increased lockdowns, there's increased movement and transfers as institutions are trying to figure out how to quarantine. And, so people are going through all this trauma on the inside, but these kind of really, it feels really, really small little steps that, the CDCR was trying to make, where local county jails, to increase communication. But it's certainly brought all of these efforts to the forefront, like visiting shut, we have no access but phones. And so in many ways, it's like this issue is more urgent than ever. And I think the pandemic has highlighted how crucial it is for folks to be able to access their loved ones. We also did see kind of this, people were afraid to go line up and go to the chow hall when that was happening, or to get food sent in. And so we saw increased commissary expenses of people trying to protect themselves the best they could, and, kind of create their own PPE and isolate in their cells and bring food on the inside. And so, our folks on the inside were mobilizing, surviving, and really kind of, the ability to connect with us out here, it was so important. And of course, people inside are getting sick at huge, numbers. And so that was also something that has been really, really hard, is, to kind of get that message. Valentina, I know you mentioned that at one point, like, for us to get the heads up, someone's being moved into quarantine, we may not hear from you for weeks. And so, people have been on eggshells. It's such a hard time to be separated from our loved ones. We all know that out here, how hard it is, and to be at the kind of mercy of these institutions and have our access to our loved ones limited has been really, really devastating.
Yeah, Amika, thanks so much for speaking to that. I want to, turn back to all of our panelists right now, starting with Valentina. And, I really, I think we're all getting a lot of calls and contacted by a lot of folks about what we did in San Francisco. And there's a lot of interest out there in advancing similar reforms. And Valentina and everyone, I would just love to hear kind of what advice would you have for other folks? After we do this round of questions and really hear from everyone, I think we're gonna, start looking at the chat. I already see Bianca answering a lot of questions. Maybe some others are too. Thanks, Bianca. But feel free to put your questions in there. But Valentina, what advice would you give to people who were getting started working on this in other places?
Well, I would just start by, initially engaging community groups, to understand the impacts of incarcerated people and their support networks. I think connecting with formerly incarcerated individuals, their families, and various community advocates to learn why these reforms are important and actually so necessary. For me, advocating for financial justice and justice reform is definitely part of my job, but it also, is a personal passion. And as a loved one who was deeply impacted by incarceration, like I was very fortunate to connect with, the San Francisco Justice Financial Justice Project through the coalition building that you started. And it just gave me the forum and the space to listen, learn, and share both my clients' experiences as well as speak to my own challenges and financial journey, as a family member impacted for decades by the high cost of jail phone calls and commissary items. And, it just really created that space. So I think it's a start, by just making the connection. But ultimately, I was able to bring some real life examples and understanding, helping to tell the stories of so many through the data and the statistics that are actually, you've been collecting, or like the groups that have been collecting. Hopefully, increasing some level of compassion and awareness, And with that, that's powerful in itself. It's an experience to let folks know about things that they are completely unaware of, and the hardship so many justice impacted loved ones just quietly endure, tolerating the responsibility for the outrageous fees and cost without dispute. We just take it because we figure this out by any means, right? So but through this experience, we connecting to this coalition, we learned to also try to find allies in the local leadership who may support these reforms, are willing to rewrite local legislation, statutes, and renegotiate contracts, go up against opposition, but ideally just partnering with advocates to prioritize, putting people literally over profit, in all the policy efforts, possibly found through folks like in the mayor's offices, board of supervisors, city council, members, but also looking to other lex, state and nationwide, because there's a spectrum of incarcerated folks, right? They will get moved. They don't just stay in one county. So it's important because they have to travel through the states or CDCR systems at some point, and it will impact the families wherever they go. Because every jail or prison has just different regulations or fees and everything else. So I'll let someone else answer as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Valentina. Paul, I want to ask what would you add to what Valentina mentioned, and just anything else on your mind?
I think Valentina said it right. Just establishing allies and coordinating with people who have a similar interest. And in addition to that, I would say community outreach and really, reaching out to the families, and especially like if you're looking at like the low income communities, almost every one of those households has somebody who's been impacted by the system, if not currently incarcerated. So just, uplifting their voice and just with, their trauma, because I read letters all the time, and, from people on the inside who are scared, that they're going to die in jail because of this pandemic. And then, you have the mothers and family and fathers and sisters and brothers like that are concerned about their loved ones. So I think just, the family reunification aspect and just trying to coordinate that. I know in San Francisco, we were privy to, work alongside the sheriff, and we had different avenues of being able to implement this survey on the inside. I know it may be more challenging in other counties. They may not, have that camaraderie or allies, inside of the jail. So if you can't, strategically do something internal, just trying to external the families and just uplifting their voice at the board of supervisors. And even then you may have board of supervisors who, represent certain districts, but are really passionate about the issues that the members of the community are faced with. And you could even have, members of the board of supervisors who have family members themselves that are incarcerated. So I think it's just establishing allies and just, centering it around the family and the reunification aspect.
Yeah, well said, and thanks so much, Paul. Amika, what advice would you have for others? I know you've been hearing from lots of folks.
Totally. I think Valentina and Paul are right on, and kind of, like building the allies, outreach, and figuring out what kind of power structures lay in your county that you can work with. But I actually really just want to speak to kind of the reality that formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated folks feel or experience when we get to the point of understanding that we are being extorted, like literally extorted, to be able to stay in relationship with our loved ones and to be able to take care of our basic needs. And so I remember the moment myself when I realized, and when I started to hear about surpluses that counties have that are literally the straight out of the pockets of our loved ones, with $10 million, $15 million in Los Angeles County. So what I would like to encourage formerly incarcerated folks to do, currently incarcerated folks that are organizing, is, to realize that these issues impact all of us. Sister warriors across the state of California are angry about it. It's really hard to hear, that we go through the motions. We don't even realize sometimes when we're picking up that phone, like what the actual kind of how the play goes, who's profiting off of us. And so I just really encourage people, that our job is often to lift up these issues that people aren't aware of. The general public is not aware of the fact that we pay these extremely excessive rates to stay in touch with our loved ones. So just want to encourage people to, kind of move with the anger of this system and this setup, and to channel that into reform and to shift and to change. And I think that this is a really, really prime moment for that, because the narrative is lifted up. A lot of people are listening. I think like allies we may have never known or someone we would have considered to be an ally, folks are stepping into this arena and paying a lot of attention. And so just to, I just really want to encourage community folks, that are thinking about doing this in their county, in their state, to move with this, to move for our loved ones, and to build the relationships that we need to tear these systems down, because I believe fully and totally that we can. It's a process. And I just would like to say, like Bianca and her, the conversation that she can lend to contracts. I mean, those are, one of the things sitting at the table, like, what contracts? We would never know. But what we know is what we bring to the table, which is those moments of not being able to access our loved ones because we have to choose what bill we're going to pay. And that experience and expertise is invaluable. And so this collective kind of community effort, requires all of our expertise and experience. And so just, really encouraging for people to move with this rage and anger of this system.
Thanks, Amika. Also really well said. Yeah, Bianca, I wonder, what else you would add to this? You talk to so many places. How would you recommend they get started?
Sure. So I've been trying to answer a lot of people's questions in the chats, because I think people get into like very technical questions, which we know that's actually like kind of where things go. I think the reality is what Amika and Valentina and Paul have been like so powerfully talking about is the experience of the community that is absolutely necessary to bring into these rooms with the legislators, the executors, commissioners, sheriffs, whoever those stakeholders might be in your particular situation or community. They need to hear from the community. They need to hear from the families that are directly impacted, from the people who are incarcerated in these facilities. And then at some point it breaks down into these really technical questions about how much is it going to cost? What do we do with the contract? What does the new RFP look like? Who's going to push back? And all of these, really critical questions. How do we push back on the concept of commissions and all of that? And these are complicated. And we'll say sheriffs, the most important thing is sheriffs fight, and they fight hard for these kickbacks and these commissions. But what we've also found is that legislators actually really aren't in for it. They don't care for it, but they're heavily swayed by sheriffs. And that is a relationship that I think we're all trying to break, right, in many, many different ways. But I'll say this, right? I think that the thing that you need to start is you need a willing stakeholder at the table that's either a legislator or an executive, be that a mayor, county commissioners, governor, state legislators. You need folks that are in those positions and willing, and you need a community that wants to bring this issue and wants to fight this battle, because it isn't an easy battle, but it is definitely a winnable battle. And so that's where I sort of just want to like lend a few last sort of thoughts, which is people are winning this fight. I think we're here to talk about San Francisco in particular, and these incredible local advocates who were able to win in San Francisco. Before San Francisco, we won in New York City. And again, a group of local advocates came to the table, and we passed the first piece of legislation in the country to make phone calls free San Francisco, followed, and now there are state and local campaigns all over the country. There is active, probably the most mature campaign is in Connecticut. There was a comment in the chat about Connecticut. Connecticut has had a bill since 2019, and in that 2019 bill passed the Judiciary Committee, passed Appropriations Committee, got down to the floor, was in an omnibus that blew up, and it blew up for unrelated reasons to the bill, and there wasn't enough time then. But that bill has been reintroduced just recently for the 2021 session. 2020 was sort of a wash for obvious reasons, but in 2021, we expect to make Connecticut the very first state to have fully free phone calls in state prisons. And that bill is now being carried because of the advocacy and work of folks on the ground by the Senate president. That's how much support it has now been able to garner. And so we're expecting that to pass. There's also a fight in Massachusetts. There's a fight in New York. These states already have bills. There are organizers who are getting together in Michigan and getting ready to start introducing something. We are hearing from counties. There was a county, San Diego, that popped into the chat at the beginning of this conversation and is thinking about how to do this themselves. There are folks in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh thinking about this. There are organizers, families getting together in Miami thinking about how to raise this. We're hearing murmurs out of Shelby and still out of other states. So this is really like a trend. It is a movement. It is happening. And because it's been happening, there's a lot for you all to learn from. I dropped a resource in the chat that hopefully can get conversations going, but there are many advocates out here who, like us at Worth Rises, who are here to help and to get you all, to the extent you want to do this in your community, in your state, in your local jurisdiction, moving. And the last thing I'll just say is that it's not just moving at the local and state level, it's also moving at the federal level, not just for federal prisons, which there was also a chat about that, but actually federal legislation that might for the first time regulate all calls across the entire country, which right now there is a limitation on what the federal FCC can regulate. But that is where we're going, and that's what we're really excited about.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bianca. And before we open it up for questions, I think everybody kind of said it all, but as the government person on the call, I want to encourage my colleagues in government to listen. I think in San Francisco we did a lot of listening to folks who were formerly incarcerated, their family members. I want to commend our sheriff's office and our mayor's office, who were also very committed to listening and just hearing about folks' experiences. A lot of the resource, as Bianca said, there's a lot of resources out there to help people. There are incredible resources at Worth Rises. We've also put a lot of these resources that we've talked about on this call in this Justice is Calling paper that we just put out. There's links to this contract. There's links to the RFP. There's links to the financial analysis that Bianca helped us do. There's the survey. So, again, you're not starting from square one. I just want to let folks know that. Just the last word I really want to say is, just the conversation about revenue. I think that when we looked at this at San Francisco, yes, there was some revenue that was coming in, and it supported programs in the jail, many of which were important programs. But again, as we didn't so much as have a beef with those programs as had a beef with how they were funded. Does it really make sense to charge someone's grandmother or their mother or their wife, and to put the costs of these programs on the backs of people who, really, really cannot afford it? So, we found that this revenue we were getting from this was really just a penny wise and a pound foolish. And we were, paying a much larger cost, in the long run by putting incarcerated people and their families in dire financial circumstances, and dimming their reentry prospects. So with that, I want to open it up to a few questions, and I want to also ask my panelists, if there's anything they'd like to speak to. One of the questions is that I'll speak to first is, and see if anyone else has any comments, is has there been any political blowback to implementing these reforms? I would really say no. What we've heard is, I think people were shocked to learn that this was how it worked, that we were generating revenue this way in government. In California, the California Public Utility Commission has opened up a regulatory process to take a hard look at what we are doing with phone calls in prisons, and even phone calls to juvenile halls, charging parents to stay in touch with their incarcerated children. We have seen hunger strikes in nearby counties in jails for people who are calling for free phone calls and more affordable commissary items. So, I would say there's been a lot of support for these reforms and that they're spreading. I want to ask my fellow panelists, there's a lot of questions in the chat. Is there anything anyone would like to speak to?
Yeah, I'll sort of address just a question that I think is probably one of the more challenging questions that came up in the chat, which is, like, how do you actually push back on the whole concept of commissions? It's difficult. Like, I don't want to sugarcoat that in any way. I think the reality is that sheriffs, unfortunately, have a lot of power in our communities, and sheriffs, particularly in places that are not urban cities where, it's, frankly, the cost or the commission that's being raised is not a huge sum within the broader budget, really put up a big fight. So rural sheriffs, suburban sheriffs, folks who are collecting those checks and want to keep collecting those checks. And so it's not, I think that in large part can often be the more difficult part of this fight, but it's not insurmountable. It means really revealing a lot of things, right? It means revealing that, most importantly, especially when we hear that commissions are being used for a variety of things, well, families shouldn't be funding prisons and jails. Like, prisons and jails are in fact funded by taxpayers. There's no reason that families should be paid or charged sort of a regressive tax, since we know that these are in large part disproportionately low-income families that are paying these rates, should be paying this regressive tax to further support operations of prisons and jails or anything else in a government agency. For those who argue that it's about programs, I always sort of ask legislators, why do you think we have prisons? Like, in your mind, what's the intent behind prisons? And you always hear some silly narrative about rehabilitation and all these things. And I'm like, well, what do you think is necessary for that? Well, programs. I said, so if everybody stopped making phone calls tomorrow, you'd stop having programs? Like, what exactly is this notion that families should be paying for programs? If it's a core function of the operation of prisons and jails, then it should actually be funded by your core operating budget, not by a variable that is depending on how much people are communicating. But most importantly, there's actually no program that has ever been proven to be more effective than communication. Communication is the only program, only function inside of prisons and jails that is routinely, consistently, through every single study, proven over and over to improve reentry success and help people thrive when they get home. Which leads me to another thing. Don't talk about recidivism. It's just frankly not even helpful. People just think about violence, and messaging wise, it's not really where people want to be. But successful reentry and thriving is like where we want people to exist. And all of that is, communication is necessary for all of that, not the other programs. Not to mention, it's quite paternalistic to say, let me take your money and determine how I can best help you, as opposed to let you keep that money and determine how you can help yourself, and how that money should be spent for you and your family. So there's a lot of arguments that can be made. I dropped the link to a messaging document that answers some of these questions with the most effective messaging that we've seen work. So a lot of that are the conversations that you need to have with the people who are in some different places of power. And so, I just want to say it's a real issue, but it's one that we can overcome.
Yeah, Bianca, thank you so much. And wow, that went by really fast. We are at the end of our time together. There's still a lot of questions in the chat. We'll work to respond to folks. Please don't hesitate to reach out to, any of us or us at the Financial Justice Project. I think, we've heard today just about the tremendous momentum across the country to put people over profits. And, there's really now is the time. So just, excited to have been here with all of you. Thank you so much. Please check out our new paper and our survey. And, be in touch, if we are able to change things in this industry and in this country, it's gonna happen if we all work together, if we all listen to each other, and if we all respect each other. So with that, thank you so much. Thanks to the Aspen Institute. Thanks to all of my fellow panelists. I feel so lucky to get to work with all of you every day in San Francisco. So thanks again, everyone. Take good care and everybody stay safe out there. Thank you.